Hey everyone, today I want to show you guys how I optimized my React app by reducing the amount of unnecessary re-renders. So, how React works is that you have multiple different components. These components are essentially an abstraction of logic within your app. For example, I could have a component for my filtering. I could have a component to show my extracurriculars. I can have a component to handle my searches and so forth. All right. All of these are basically just abstraction of a different logic that I have within this specific page. Now, within each component, React has this feature called re-rendering. Essentially, React will update your component whenever it needs to by reloading it. All right. So when you have different UI changes or different things that you need to send, right, specifically with state management, you will essentially reload your component. All right. So that your component is now updated to the specific value or specific UI that you need it to be on. But now there's a huge issue with this whole feature, and that is that if you do not manage React rendering properly, it will cause a lot of things called unnecessary re-renders. Essentially, what that means is that you're going to be re-rendering a specific block of code or component which does not change at all, meaning you do not need to reload it, right? Because it will stay the same regardless. So when you're reloading it, you're just essentially causing performance issues, right? Because it's unnecessary. It's just dead weight. So to solve this, first things first, you want to make sure that your app is actually modularized. And what do I mean by this? I mean have your component's logic be abstracted, all right? And that was not the case with my extracurriculars component over here. Every piece of logic, every piece of code, every piece of JSX was written in only one component. And this is a huge issue. And that is because now React recognizes all this code as only one component. And that means whenever you make a specific change to only one feature, you only really need that feature to be, re-rendered. For example, for search, right? When you search something, you only want this part and this part to be re-rendered, right? Because that's where you need the changes to happen. But since it's all in one component, you're going to be re-rendering this, but you're also going to be re-rendering this. And that's because React doesn't know any better. It sees this all as just one component. So it's like, oh, there's a change made. Okay, let's re-render the whole component because that's what it's meant to do. That's its expected behavior. But since you put this and this in the same component, it will cause this to re-render as well. So to combat that, first of all, just make sure that you put both of these in separate components and make sure you put everything in separate components based on their functionality. All right. So for example, this would be my filtration system. So I'd put this in a separate component because that is filtering. That's my functionality. This is showing extracurricular pages. All right. So that's its own functionality. You can determine it and it can be whatever you want, but make sure it's actually something functional within your app. Okay. So now that you have different components, what do you do with them? Well, you put all of these into a parent component, essentially making these components that you built, all right, children component. And what this means is think of a dynamic of a parent and a child, right? A parent is the provider, right? It provides for the child. Same thing really applies to the principles in React. You're going to have a parent component and then you're going to have children component who rely on that parent component to be seen, right? Because this parent component will be in different places. In my case, within this route, right? And these children component will just be inside that parent component, so that to actually view these children components, they need that parent component to be seen. The reason for this is that you can have multiple components within your parent component. All right. So it gives the illusion that it's just one page, right? That's what we see here, right? We see just one page with different, sections, right? But in reality, what you should see as a developer or what React sees is different components, right? Which are in just one shared component, which is the parent component. They just see this, this, and this, and this, and this, right, as different things, right? They see them as different components. We see everything as one, but they see it as just different components, right? And that's what we want. So first start off by doing that, right? In this case, that was not the case. As I said, everything was just pushed into one component, and that component was super, super big, all right? So as I just explained, that causes a lot of unnecessary re-renders, but it also leads to a poor developer experience for other people that you bring on to the app. And that's because reading a huge component is very, very hard. And a lot of times, the developer's main job is to actually just read code. They don't really write that much code. I can see that personally with Talon, right? My job literally comprises like 60% of just understanding the code and then improving on it, all right? So it's a lot of reading code, and you don't want to make their lives terrible, right? You don't want to make it like hell, because there's going to be a lot of developers just reading this code, right? So if you have a lot of lines of code within one specific component, it makes it very, very hard to understand it. But when you have everything in different components, which are segregated based on their functionality, if a developer just needs to worry about the filtration system, they can just go to that component and just start writing their code or learning about it and start reading about it, right? They don't need to keep like filtering and searching using the VS Code find option. They don't need to keep doing that in that big gunk of code. They can just simply move to the components. All right. So that's why it leads to a better developer experience. Okay, so now I did this, right? That was the first thing I did. I modularized everything. Everything is in its own like components, and then these children component are just being served into a parent component, so you can actually see them, right, as one. But the issue was now, all right, React did recognize, the different things as like the different functionalities as different components, but the re-rendering was still occurring. And the reason why the re-rendering was still occurring was because of prop drilling. So, what is prop drilling? Essentially, these children components, all right, some of these children components needed to share props, or I should say states actually. So they needed to share specific states together. Specifically, this search component and then this EC items components, they needed to share some states, all right? So since they needed to share these states, what I did initially was I just added these states into the parent component, because remember the dynamic, the parent component provides to the children component. So I can just provide these states within the children components that need it, right? Specifically the search and the this EC items, right? This might seem like a really intuitive experience and really, really good approach, but it's really not. And that's because what's going to happen is it will re-render all the children component whenever you make a change to that specific state. All right. So instead of only changing this specific component and re-rendering it, right? Because as you search, it's going to change, obviously, right? Instead of doing that, it will do that, right? It will give you that functionality. But along with that, it will also re-render this, because this component is also in the parent component, all right? And that parent component actually supplies these states. And if you know a thing or two about states, whenever there's a change within the state, whichever component is subscribed to it or references that state will be changed or re-rendered. In our case, the parent component. So in reality, what's happening was that when I was writing something, it's actually re-rendering the parent state. And since the parent state includes the children components, specifically this section and this section, it's going to re-render everything. All right, so it's basically doing the same thing. It's just that I've just now made a better developer experience. So now I had to learn how I can still be able to allow my components to share states among each other, right? But allow it to have selective rendering, so that only components which are subscribed to specific states can, can re-render. Otherwise, the other components can just, sit back, not re-render because they're not going to be changed. There's no reason for it. And there's actually solutions out there to do this. All right. The two main ones that I would recommend is Zustand and Redux. Okay. These are the two main ones. Specifically, I would highly recommend using Zustand, and that's because it's very small, meaning that there's not going to be huge performance hinder, specifically with your node modules, right? And it's really easy to get started, all right? And it's very fast. And additionally, out of all of that, big projects can use it. It's very, very scalable. But, there are going to be that 1% of use cases where you're going to need a lot of complex and a lot of flexibility in terms of your state management. That is when I would recommend Redux. But again, once you add Redux, your developer experience will go significantly down. And that's because Redux allows for a lot of boilerplates. You need this boilerplate code to get started. With Zustand, you don't. You just need to create a store and you're good to go, right? So it's much more easy and straightforward with Zustand rather than React Redux. But of course, there are use cases for it, and there's reasons why a lot of companies use it. But again, adapt to this technology. This is going to be good for 99% of use cases, because many times our state management is not that complicated to reach the point where you need to use Redux. Okay, but if it is, go ahead. All right, go ahead. Essentially, all you need is a state management system. Okay, or a solution, or whatever you want to call it, right? But you just need something. All right, there's also other ones out there. I'm not really aware of that much, but Zustand is essentially the popular one. You can see there's a lot of downloads. All right, so we're gonna use this. So all you need to do is just install it, and once you have installed it, all you need to do is create a store. Essentially, the store is the hook. All right, so you know how you use the use state? That's a hook, right? So the store is just your hook, which will replace the use state. Okay, and within this hook, you can have different states. All right, and you can have states and functions too. So a state would be recognized like this, right? Where you're gonna have your state, then colon, and then the value, which will act as your initial value. Then for the functions, you can just have the same sort of setup, but then you're just gonna call a callback function, and they also provide their own function, which is set within Zustand, right? And this will just set a specific state to some data that you provide. All right, so you can add a parameter here called data or whatever, and if you just reference that over here, it would just set that bare state in this case to that specific value, right? Whenever you call this function, okay? So this way you can basically go ahead and replace your logic of states and set states with this specific store, all right? Then all you need to do is you need to reference these hooks that you create, okay? So I'll recommend just creating one hook to start, all right? One store, I should say. And this store can have multiple states, multiple functions, all of that. And then over here, you can see that they have actually created two functions, okay? The first one is bear counter, and the second one is controls. Okay, so basically what's happening is with increased population is just adding one to the bear state. Okay, so over here, all you need to do is create two functions, and you can just subscribe to the specific, state or function that you need. Okay, and you do that through this functionality. So now by using this solution, basically what you're doing is you're allowing React to subscribe to a specific state, which is went ahead and referenced within your store. Then what you're doing is whenever this state is changed, all right, or deleted or whatever, right, it's modified, I should say, that those specific components, all right, the specific components which reference that state, all right, or are subscribed to that state will be re-rendered. Nothing else. All right, nothing else will be re-rendered, and we'll see that right now with my solution. Okay, so for example, let's say I had another state over here called cats, and then I had increased population bears and increased population cats, same code. Okay, it's just that there's now I have two states. If I went ahead and did the same functionality here, like this, right, but just for the cats state, all right, just changing the state, and if I press one up for bears, all right, it will not re-render. You will not see a highlight within the cats components, and that's because the cats components are different states which are not subscribed to the specific state being changed. This means that we can additionally just stop the unnecessary re-renders fully. All right, and through doing all of this, we can also share different states between different components, and you can see that literally here, right? I can literally call a new component, right? Same thing here, right? And I can literally reference this state over here, right? And that state will now be subscribed to that specific component. All right. So then basically what will happen is both of those said components, theoretical components, will change whenever there is a change to the bear state. Okay. So hopefully that made sense. It is a little bit more advanced React, so I would recommend learning what components are, trying to build some projects out before you get into state management and optimizing your unnecessary renders. But once you've done that, I think it's really, really good to understand. Okay, so here's my optimized version. All right, and let's go ahead and see the difference. All right, I'm going to start off by searching. So over here, the bad version, if I do model United Nations, you can see that the whole app is being highlighted, and that's because first of all, we haven't modularized it, and second of all, there's a lot of prop drillings. To fix that, use a state management solution. Let's look at our solution. Here I use Zustand, and I modularized everything. Everything is in its own components. So let me search up the same thing. Model United. You can see, literally you can see that only this part is being updated, and that's because only this part is being referenced to the specific state. All right. And you can see that when I make any changes, it's only allowing this part of the area to be changed. This component is not being re-rendered, this component is not being re-rendered, and this component is also not being re-rendered. Okay, let's try going to bookmarks. You can see over here the same thing, right? When I click this, it's just re-rendering this part and re-rendering this part. So you can see it's very, very optimized, right? As opposed to here, when I click this, the whole app re-renders, right? Because there's highlights all over the place. Okay, so by using those two solutions, you are essentially saving a lot of performance, right? And remember, there's always going to be re-renders. You cannot stop re-renders because that's how React works, right? Re-renders is the way that you update components, right? And there's gonna be, literally in all apps, you're gonna need some updating, right? So do not try to necessarily stop re-renders, but stop unnecessary re-renders. Okay, so I hope this helped. This is more of an advanced topic, but by doing this, right, you're basically tapping into more production level React, because many companies use some sort of state management solution when they're using React because of the reasons that I literally just specified. So I hope this helped. This is a more advanced sort of video, and yeah, take care.